City tonight, the to-do list returns. Let's return, though, first to Syria, as the international community gently eases itself into a relationship with the country's new leadership, the rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Foreign Secretary David Lammy has confirmed the UK has been in contact with the group that ousted the Assad regime, despite technically them being prescribed as a terrorist organisation, although it's important to point out it was diplomatic contact rather than the direct contact that the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said America had had over the weekend. Well, meanwhile, Turkey's defence minister says that they are ready to offer military support and training to Syria if the new administration asks for it. It's an opportunity, it seems, for President Erdogan, who has picked the right horse in that rebel group, hasn't he? Well, let's get the lowdown. Let's dissect where we are with Syria this weekend with Wael Al-Zayat, who's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., a former Syria outreach contributor as well for the US Ambassador Robert Ford. Wael, hello, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And Evie Aspinall is director of the British Foreign Policy Group and is with us too tonight. Evie, hello, good evening.
Hi, good evening.
What is this dialogue that the UK is having through diplomatic channels? What is it likely to include?
So I think it's important to note that it's not necessarily David Lammy himself picking up the phone to the rebels or them directly either. It's a much more kind of disconnected, longer-term diplomatic relationship that's starting to be built. It's very, very early stages, and it's very much kind of an offer from the UK and from many of our allies to be there to support what we hope will be a more inclusive government moving forward. And I think there's lots of concerns about the rebels that are now in charge. There's an opportunity here, it is hoped, to kind of win them over, bring them on side and create a better future for Syria.
And while this is an interesting precedent being set here because it's not direct contact, it's diplomatic contact, but it is contact all the same with an organisation the UK government have prescribed as terrorists.
It is, but I think it's pragmatic and it's what's needed. I mean, there's a historic change happening in the heart of Middle East as something that, almost no one expected to happen the way it did. And it's incumbent upon whether it's the UK or the United States or other countries to get in there and to make contact, to form their own opinions of what's happening and to leverage this moment. Syria is in need of rebuilding. The economy is in tatters and the people need to come out of a very dark period. So there's a lot of opportunity here to forge a new chapter. Yes, there are many challenges, but we will never find out if we don't engage.
It's interesting, Wael, in terms of particularly America's lead on this, but also let's fold Western allies into that as well, the United Kingdom and other other European countries. I look at the way in which the United States have so unsuccessfully persuaded Israel to take a certain course of action, perhaps. The way in which it feels like the US and Western allies' influence over the Middle East at large has significantly waned, and how much this most recent escalation in violence has demonstrated that. What chance America and the United Kingdom really have in persuading HTS to do anything or to act anyway?
It's a very good question. I think the influence is low, especially that over the last few years, the U.S. really withdrew from the Syria file with the exception of supporting about 900 U.S. soldiers in the northeastern part of the country with the Syrian Democratic Forces. It really did not lead politically in support of a political dialogue or provide much assistance to the opposition, even on the humanitarian side. So it's low leverage, but still, the U.S. can offer so much more, including with its ability to convene and to set precedent here. If the United States is engaging with this new government, is providing support, is attending conferences for rebuilding Syria, that's going to send a demand signal to a lot of other countries, which itself would have a multiplying effect for the prospects of their success.
Okay, and then, Evie, there's the other element of this, of course, which is, are the United Kingdom, the EU and the United States all going to be on the same path after the 20th of January? What does the Trump administration mean for that dialogue? And could it be that the Western allies spend more time talking to each other about this than they do the Middle East?
I mean, absolutely. I think there's a lot of unknowns with the potential Trump presidency. I don't think he perhaps even knows what he's doing. So it's always hard to predict what's coming next. But I think for the UK and Europe particularly, we're in a couple of months where we really want to showcase our potential and opportunity to lead on the world stage because we are nervous that the United States may pull back. And finding opportunities where we can showcase to the US as well our relevance, our importance to strengthen those bonds. But yeah, there'll be lots of insider talking between the West in the next couple of months, especially as we feel out Trump and work out where he lies on some of the key issues.
And while this has been your jurisdiction, I mean, you were the outreach coordinator for the US's ambassador Robert Ford to Syria. You have been directly involved in these sorts of conversations. How do you expect the Trump administration? How do you expect the dialogue to change under a Trump administration, if at all?
Yeah, it's too early to tell, but I expect them to still work with countries like Turkey, primarily, perhaps Jordan, on this engagement. I have seen some early indications that they may view HTS with even dimmer light than the Biden administration. That may complicate their willingness to engage them. I hope they don't, because we're at such a sensitive, pivotal point. The U.S. has many sanctions on Syria, going all the way back to the 1970s, and Syria's support for terrorism in the region. Assad is gone. Syria is not occupying Lebanon anymore, and the country's going to need rebuilding. And I do think, though, just looking at it, quite frankly, I think the Republican Party will be a bit more difficult to navigate when it comes to not just only engaging groups like HTS, but beginning to lift these sanctions.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Turkey there. Evie, just take us to Turkey, because another interesting dynamic in this story is President Erdogan, and an opportunity perhaps for President Erdogan. Just give us the context, Evie, here, and how he has quite clearly backed the right horse in supporting this rebel group.
I mean, absolutely. He's backed the right horse, and Russia perhaps backed the wrong one. And I think there's a big question here around the role of Turkey moving forwards, particularly in the region, but particularly for Europe as well. I think there's a big challenge that Erdogan is very different in his politics and his policies to many in Europe, and he's proving a tricky kind of partner and collaborator for Europe moving forwards, and actually will be key, however, in kind of negotiations moving forward with HTS. So one that will be a key stakeholder that we're going to have to work out how to engage effectively with.
Okay. Well, it could be a key foothold for Erdogan in the Middle East, couldn't it, Syria?
Well, I mean, Turkey has already built a foothold for itself by supporting the opposition over the course of the civil war, particularly providing protection to Syrians in the northwest pocket, particularly against Russia and the regime, and have maintained open borders for them to some degree, delivering aid and other goods, including even electricity to some parts of Syria. They're looked upon as the main benefactor, but also them hosting a large number of refugees as well gives them a certain degree of leverage. So there's a lot of, everyone is clear-eyed about that Turkey is a sovereign state and has its own interests vis-a-vis Syria, but there's a good amount of goodwill from the Syrian people when they look around and look at the countries that have stood with them, and I think they're going to be able to capitalize on that quite a bit.
I think flags of Erdogan's face being flown, weren't there, in Damascus the other day? Yes. I saw during some of those celebrations. Evie, it's a complicated picture, obviously, but there is a suggestion. I read an interesting piece in the Times this weekend that was considering the financial opportunity for Erdogan as well, potentially big old contracts flowing Turkey's way during a potential rebuild of Syria.
Absolutely. I mean, nations are very often self-interested in a lot of this kind of stuff when it comes to conflicts and wars, and the reconstruction project in Syria and kind of moving forwards, working out Syria's opportunities. There'll be a huge opportunity there for Turkey and Erdogan, which he will absolutely seek to take. He is very economically minded. He's keen to kind of, and as many particularly authoritarian or leaders are, very keen to show their economic value. So he will absolutely be looking for opportunities. I think there's a genuine interest in Syria, but there is also that economic component that really is driving him.
Okay, well, let's just consider the Syria's dynamic with Israel that has developed this weekend, because today the group's leader today, HTS's leader today, said that Syria is too tired for a war with Israel. Israeli troops continue to occupy that zone beyond Golan Heights. How do you see that dynamic playing out?
Yeah, I mean, look, what the leader of HTS said is true. Syrians are in no position to be fighting a war. let alone with Israel. And they're just trying to emerge from, the Assad rule and rebuild the country. So militarily, they're not capable. And emotionally, they certainly are not. And so I've spoken with a lot of Syrians on the ground. They've been very terrified by these bombings, over 400 airstrikes. They feel that this is in terribly poor taste to welcome them back to the fold of the civilized world, and they're very afraid. Also, just these bombings could hurt civilians; they could hurt people, and they really wish it wasn't this way. And they're very concerned that some Syrian groups would react, and that gives pretext to the Israelis, to Prime Minister Netanyahu, to do even more damage to Syria or occupy more land. And so it really is puzzling. The weapons that they have destroyed pose no threat to Israel, but they are the property of the Syrian people.
Okay, interesting. Just on the issue of weapons, Evie, the Chemical Weapons Watchdog has said that they would like further access to try to identify some of the perpetrators of those attacks and to perhaps get a bit of a sense of what chemical weapons were used by the Assad regime. Do you think that will come to pass? I mean, is this a moment where HTS can sort of clear deck and open themselves up to watchdogs like the Chemical Weapons Watchdog?
I think, they can choose to, but I think we shouldn't over-glamorize them as a group. They are linked to Al-Qaeda. They have a very challenging past, particularly around human rights abuses. There's lots of concerns about minorities, and so we shouldn't assume that they're going to be opening up to the world and kind of giving us all this access and addressing all of these issues. That said, they'll be very keen to highlight many of the challenges with the Assad regime and some of the atrocities of that's very much in their favour. So they may well choose to open up, but how transparent they'll be, and particularly about their own challenges, I think is another matter.
Okay, well, I said earlier at the start of this conversation that the international community were easing themselves into a relationship with this organisation. And of course, there's a heck of a long road ahead, isn't there, as to what that administration looks like, who has jurisdiction over what parts of Syria, what that governance looks like over the coming years. And I just wonder, from your perspective, on what metrics should the international community judge this new group, this new administration and their leadership of Syria? Where should they lie? Where should they sort of place the red lines in terms of how they judge them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Look, I think it is a spectrum here. I think at a minimum, is the transition continuing to be peaceful? Is there systematic retribution and extrajudicial killing of members of the previous regime without due process? Are there, arbitrary rules put in place that are adversely affecting women or minorities, right? Those are the kind of signs that you see that could give you an indication of which way this is heading. And also, HTS has promised, or the new temporary government has promised to open up the political process as early as March, that the current set of cabinet officials and the prime minister are only there temporarily, and after which there would be a more inclusive process. So all of those are markers and goalposts, I think, to keep an eye on. And if these things don't happen, and there is a bit more of an open, inclusive process leading, obviously, to at least a date set for free and fair elections, that I think that's a pretty good indication.
Okay. Really lovely having your company tonight, both of you. Incredibly insightful. Thank you so much. Wael Al-Zayat, he's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington and a former Syria outreach coordinator for US Ambassador Robert Ford, and Evie Aspinall, as well, director of the British Foreign Policy Group, with us on Times Radio tonight. Okay, well.